There are some certain nomenclature guidelines to Scrum that are pretty much generally agreed on. The ones that I reference are from the Scrum Alliance. That I want to talk about these words in particular because they actually have an impact on how testing gets done. There are three main areas in the Scrum framework that are very heavily detailed. The roles, ceremonies, and the artifacts. The roles in Scrum being a product owner, a Scrum Master, and the team. I'll say right now, there is no notion or description of a tester, a traditional tester or a QA. That does not exist in the Scrum world. So to say I work on a Scrum team and I'm a QA, that may be fine. That may be fine. But that is not detailed and documented in the Scrum framework, how to be a tester. You'd be on the team. There are ceremonies, the sprint planning meeting, the sprint review, and the daily Scrum. Like I said, this is not an intro to Agile or intro to Scrum, so I hope you go and find out what those things are. Those aren't particular to this discussion we're having today. The artifacts that you produce in Scrum, namely the product backlog, the sprint backlog, and burn down charts. Again, I want to point out the artifacts in Scrum are not a test plan, a set of test cases, test reports, test results. That's not. If your team decides to do that, that's fine. But that's not dictated by Scrum. It is important here to point out that in Scrum, one of the foundation ideas in Scrum is that teams are self-organizing, self-forming. The most successful organizations that I work with that do Scrum, they have suggestions for teams and they have practices that work. Any individual team can decide, I don't want to do that practice, or our team can decide, we're not going to do that practice. We don't think that practice is really that important, and our team can do just fine without that role or without making that artifact, and that's fine. Two teams sitting right next to each other in the same company can be very successful having a different Scrum practice. Scrum is about self-forming teams. Scrum is about trusting individuals and their how intelligent they are, how they work together, their work habits. It's not about forcing you to conform to one specific guideline as to this is how you work. So if a team decides we don't want to have QA on our team, in Scrum they don't have to, because they're self-organizing and self-forming teams. So I'm stressing this idea that teams are self-forming and that there is no specified role for QA in the Scrum framework, because there isn't. So if you say, how do you test in Scrum? How do you do this? What's the role of a QA in Scrum? There isn't one. The way that your company will implement these practices and what your specific group decides to do is really up to your specific group. So this is really going to be up to you as to what practices you can communicate to your team are essential to releasing a high-quality product. So, in Scrum, we have this idea of user stories. We've moved away from sets of requirements documents. If we were going to have a discussion about writing big requirements documents and lean manufacturing and getting rid of big documents, that would be its own course in itself. So we have these user stories that are, in many cases, just written on index cards. So it's the amount of information you can fit on a 4x6 card. And there are specific suggestions for how you write these user stories. As a user, I want to something so that I can something. I don't want to talk about the specific format for that, because how teams implement it is really unique in different organizations. But there is a specific thing about these user stories that I want to talk about, and that is in any reading that you do about user stories are about the card, conversation, and confirmation. Ron Jeffries coined that phrase of the 3 C's. That is actually really important. There's the card, the conversation, and the confirmation. So we have the card. We're going to write some text on the card, and you'll write your estimates, and you'll write priorities, and you'll write how much time you think it's going to take, and you'll start detailing out some you could even be detailing out some test cases or some important notes about that slide, about that card. So there is this user story. But then we have the conversation about it. It's that discussion of, well, how long do you think it's going to take to write this? Well, what are you going to do in your unit testing? How am I going to test this? What environment do I have to test this on? What would a user do here? The conversation around the user story is where you're going to be developing most of your test cases, right? So already we know that this is going to be a problem if I have teams that are not co-located. If I have teams in remote time zones, we have to cross that hurdle of the conversation. And then we have confirmation. We're going to talk about the confirmation when we talk about XP practices, but that individual user story needs to be confirmed. It's like having a requirement and having the requirement validated. So we have the card, we have the conversation, and we have the confirmation of that user story. Another important practice, or not practice, but another important suggestion in Scrum is that you have a definition of done. What does it mean to be done? If we were thinking in terms of traditional software development, we will have a month-long phase, an alpha or a beta, or we could have a system testing, integration testing. It could last for a month, it could last for 6 months. But at the end of that phase, we're going to have milestone criteria. And oftentimes that milestone criteria revolves around the developers are going to do a bunch of work, and then the testers are going to test it when they're done. Well, in these really compressed Scrum cycles, it could be two weeks or 3 weeks or 4 weeks, which are the common suggestions, the most common suggestions for a sprint. There's something that we need to make sure it doesn't happen. And in a worst case scenario, I could have 2 weeks of development, and on the last day of that sprint, I could have somebody write some code or make changes to that code and say, okay, well, we're done. We're going to have the sprint retrospective this afternoon, and I finished writing my code, and I checked it into source safe, so it's done. Without it ever having been tested, without having anybody do a peer review, whatever it is that your team decides it has to do to release quality software, in such a compressed cycle, a 2-week development cycle, you have to have a new definition of done. To see that whatever you decide has to happen in a sprint, that it actually happens, and that things don't go up till the day before and the last day, which is a common thing that we have to watch out for. So it's not a replacement. Done. The definition of done is not a replacement for milestone criteria on longer phases, but they're related. And the most successful teams have a very specific set of criteria of what it means to be done with our sprint. So. That's the end of this first segment, and in the next segment we're going to be talking about extreme programming and XP practices and how they impact testers. See you then.